Like I said, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down and have a chat with me. There's a lot that I want to talk to. I find mindfulness and the connection between like our emotional state and our physical capability a very, very fascinating subject. And just kind of knowing the little bit about you that I do know, and you kind of explained to me your journey sort of through training and starting to work with clients and starting to develop a little bit more through the mindfulness avenue. Was that more of like a natural progression for yourself as you were kind of, and I feel like a lot of PTs, or when you start working in the health and fitness industry, a lot of it is you start by focusing with the training and then you start to incorporate a little bit of recovery. And the more you're in it, the more you realize that ultimately it comes down to like understanding people, their attitudes, their perspective, and what drives them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Ben, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. It's just understanding people. And sometimes in life, you're thrust into situations that are not of your own doing. And you find yourself dealing with a certain type of clientele. And it's my experience that no two personal trainers share the same clientele. So for me, I was working in the area of rehabilitation predominantly, and liaising a lot with osteos and physios and surgeons and so forth. And I began to see a number of clients who had a correlation between their emotional health, their mental health, and their injuries. And so I started taking notes, and I observed this same pattern over the years. Um, and so the more I investigated it, the more I went into it in terms of studying courses. So I did all the Paul Chek courses, a number of Poliquin courses, Gary Gray, and I really loved going down that avenue. And then I hit this turning point where, whilst all that was really great learning and undertaking, I wanted to know more about the mind-body connection. And so I fell into this area of working with clinical psychologists and sports psychologists in mentoring programs, because I didn't want to go off to uni and do a 4 or 5 year degree course to understand the mind better. I wanted to get it firsthand from clinicians.
Yeah.
And so I was seeing a lot of clients who had injuries that were related to suppressed emotions. And they were emotions that were suppressed in terms of anger, anxiety, grief, sadness, depression. And so the more I researched that, I found this connection between repressed emotions and physiological health.
Yeah.
And that was a real turning point for me. And then I eventually wrote a book about it, which was really an enlightening experience of putting down all this data. And I'd interviewed, I think, about 1,500 clients throughout a 3 or 4 year period, and that sort of summed up a lot of the work that went
Yeah.
into this book. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it the like obviously the biggest issue I guess with a lot of the repressed emotions is for the most part we're not really aware that we're doing it, right? So is that the first when we talk about self-awareness and mindfulness, is that kind of what we're talking about, is starting to dig below like the conscious a little bit? Like where does it how do we take that first step into starting to see, is that me? Am I falling into that category?
Yeah, great question, Ben. And it really comes down to bringing your thoughts to the forefront of your mind. And in many of these cases, it's a protective mechanism, and many of us do it, and so we repress trauma. A lot of the trauma can be from childhood trauma. And there's, a number of psychologists talk about the ACE score, which is a measure of how we interpret trauma, in our later life. And so mindfulness is really about noticing our thought patterns, or what I call our thought landscape. So are we predominantly, um, you know, uh, positive thinkers, and not positive in that Pollyanna syndrome where, you tend to, mask negativity, but, are you a predominant positive thinker where you see the benefits in a negative situation, or are you predominantly a negative thinker? So it allows us to see our thoughts. Do you remember, you may not remember the Viewmaster, and it's this little thing that you put up to your eyes, and it was a toy, a childhood toy, and you'd click it on the side, and you'd put in these round slides, and they were, it might be like Pocahontas,
Yeah.
and it sort of go, yeah.
Yeah. I think I remember
So
you have some with landscapes and stuff too, right?
that's it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
it.
yeah.
So it's similar to that. It's sort of noticing a scene in your mind and observing it by distancing oneself from the thought. Because many of us subscribe to the notion that because I have a thought, it must be true. But there's an observer, there's a person also witnessing the thought. So therefore, it's almost there are two minds concurrently occurring in the backdrop of our minds. So one is the observer and the other is the thinker. So really, mindfulness is just bringing your thoughts to the forefront of your mind, observing them, and disentangling yourself from what those thoughts are actually saying.
Yeah. You'd be a big fan of journaling. Would that be a fair way? Is that the easiest way to start? Is that the easiest way just to write down the thoughts when you catch them?
Absolutely. So, in fact, one of the things that I do when working with coaching clients online, Ben, is the first, port of call is really just to start a journal, and we do that for 30 days, and get them into the habit of just not interpreting, but putting their thoughts on paper, because we can't interpret what we're thinking, but we can start to see them, and then we go, wow, I'm actually thinking a lot of negative thoughts most of the time.
Mhm.
Why is that? And you would appreciate this from your nutritional background, is that nutrition constitutes a great deal of the way in which we think, because our gut microbiome influences our thought process and our emotional constitution. So it's interesting when clients eventually get onto some sort of a cleansing program and detoxifying their gut and repopulating their gut, through probiotics, prebiotics, and so forth. They see a change in thought patterns, and their emotions also change as well.
Yeah, yeah. I can't tell you how many clients when they report if they're constipated, how negative their mindset is on literally everything else that's going on around them,
Yeah.
right? So, the thing with journaling, and I've like I'm an advocate for it, and I've done extended periods of it, and you definitely do notice trends. Like it always tends to be maybe 3 or 4 different specific emotions that tend to stem a lot of the thoughts that you get to. But I always get to a point with it where once I start writing down that one particular thought I'm having, how much of my doing that is simply now priming like the next thought in the chain and the next thought in the chain. So how like if you're having your clients do it and they're starting out, is it sit down for 10 minutes and kind of go on that 10 minutes, or is it every time you kind of become consciously aware of a thought, like try to write it down at the time? What's the best approach on that one?
So I guess the best approach is, for the first 30 days, we spend just becoming aware of the thought. So if the person has had no experience in this area, then that's an enlightening
Yeah.
experience. So then it's about building. So then we move into self-inquiry, and there's a wonderful, and I use a lot of material that's already out there, because it's and when I say out there in books and courses and so forth. And there's a wonderful teacher called Byron Katie, BYRON KATIE, and she wrote a remarkable book called The Work. And she asks that people look at 4 questions. And self-inquiry then is then a way of actually journaling deeper. So then we look at things like, is this thought true? So we ask that question. That's one of the 4 questions. Can I absolutely know that this thought is true? For example, it might be, what evidence is there that this thought is true? And then you challenge the thought or the belief underlying that thought. So what you're really doing is becoming your own therapist, in a sense. And when you do, you then disentangle yourself from the thought, because thoughts are effectively synapses in the brain that have made neural connections so tightly that every time we weave a new thought, they become intertwined by blood supply and by neurons and dendrites that are building stronger networks in the brain. So what we've almost got to do is break that neural structure and build a new neural structure. And there's a wonderful person that does a great deal of work in this area called Dr. Joe Dispenza. And he's incredible, and he talks about disentangling and breaking the old person that we once were to create the new person that we want to become. And just a quick one too on that, Albert Einstein said that we can't solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created the problem in the first instance. And so he was saying that we can't solve problems by using the same problem mindset. We've got to break that neural structure and create a new paradigm, a new mental shift in order to solve our problems.
Yeah. Joe Dispenza is really big on like manifestation and visualization and like attention, right?
Yeah, he goes into a lot of the healing components as well. So he talks a
Yeah.
lot about healing, self-healing. He really gets into a lot of that mindfulness and changing your thoughts, changing your future as well.
Yeah. Now, specifically for your area, I guess on interest is more that mind muscle connection and how much that thought process can actually manifest as physical ailment, right?
Mm.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, when we identify with a thought, Ben, such as, my arm hurts me, we tend to draw awareness to that area. So we're being mindful in a negative way. So we've got this pain in our arm. It may have been caused by a bump. It could be some sort of inflammatory condition. It may have been a result of exercise, whatever. We've now got this pain. So suddenly we focus our attention. So we're literally sending so much awareness to that area. And there was a pharmacologist who said, Candace Pert, who said the body is the subconscious mind. And they found opiate receptors in the brain and also in the gut that identified that the body had its own intricate system or its own brain. And not just the gut-brain axis, but cells within the body. And so if we've got this injury, suddenly we're drawing our awareness to it. And so we notice it all the time that it becomes amplified. And so the brain has a hierarchical structure. And in that hierarchical structure, it begins to allocate resources. And so it says, oh, well, this must be important because, Ben keeps referring to his elbow pain. So it amplifies this elbow pain. And suddenly that's all you're thinking about, elbow pain. And one of the exercises I do in seminars is I ask people to focus on, their right elbow or an injured part. And I say, okay, shift that awareness now to an uninjured part, a part that's healthy, strong, and vital. It might be your left shoulder or your lower back. And once they begin to notice that other area, I ask them about the pain, and they notice the pain almost gets dialed down.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it is that where we shift our attention becomes our focal point, and we can manifest and amplify our physiological pathology, or we can learn to turn down the volume on it. And this isn't to say that we don't go and see an osteo, that we don't get it looked at. It's not saying that at all, because that would be illogical. It would be bad advice. You still go and see a doctor, you still go and see an osteo, but what it does, it gives you another tool within the toolbox to use the power of your mind to actually heal the body. But you're not healing it 100% with thoughts alone. You're using an integrative model of healing. Again, as you know, you're using an integrated model of the mind-body connection and also emotions to heal that respective elbow.
Yeah. And how do you start? Because I assume with what you're kind of getting at, like negative mind, like negative thought patterns, and that becomes a habit, right? And it becomes a habit that is kind of on repeat for an extended period of time, and usually those long-lasting habits are quite difficult to break. So if you are starting to pay attention and you do realize that the majority of what you're thinking is actually, and I think sometimes it's deceptively disguised, right, as like self-protection, or like you're being a realist. You're not pessimistic, you're just being a realist. How do you start to kind of shift the podium there a little bit, other than the journaling? Is it like a has to be a conscious decision on some level, I would assume? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. I mean, great question. And the journaling is the first process, because first we've got to get some data. We've
Yeah.
got to know what the client or the patient is actually doing in terms of their thinking process. Once they have a snapshot for at least 30 days, then we move into the next mode. And the next mode is an area that Dr. Daniel Siegel, who's a well-respected psychiatrist in the US, calls name and tame. And it's about naming and taming the emotions. So, for example, if we're constantly caught up in negativity, such as anger, then when the thoughts appear, we name it. So we might say, here is anger. And that's all you do. Eventually, you can use the word anger and just say anger. So what you're doing is you're shining a spotlight on the anger instead of it becoming unconscious and moving through the body, because it takes 2.5 minutes for an emotion to move through the nervous system. Yet some people have held on to anger for decades. I mean, I know clients that have repressed anger and have held it in their nervous system for 30 years. And it's until they do some type of counseling work or therapy or breath work and move the emotion through the body that it literally disappears overnight.
Yeah. And then, I mean, there'd have to be a process too, right? Of kind of, again, deep diving into maybe what your first thought that emotion is. Like, I'm sure, there are other emotions that maybe manifest as anger, right? And maybe that is fear or something else. Like, how do you kind of dig deeper than the peripheral?
So that's where the self-inquiry tends to come up. And of course, working with, a trained therapist. So obviously I don't ever take the role of a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist. So if I find that there's an underlying trauma there, it might be a childhood trauma or some type of trauma or abuse, then obviously I refer the individual to a therapist. They work with a therapist and I liaise with them. But in most cases where it might be just rumination, where the person is ruminating on negative thoughts, we identify the fact that they have created a habit because they've shined the light or focused their awareness on this particular area. We then help them to shift that awareness by showing them that that thought is incongruent and creating external conditions, whether it be physiological or external conditions in their environment that are not conducive, and then shifting their awareness to the new future that they want to create.
Okay. And at the same time too, there's probably, situations where an emotion like anger is potentially positive or useful, right? Arousal before like a heavy lift or something of that nature. So again, I guess it becomes even more convoluted when you're saying, well, I'm not going to let it essentially control my subconscious decision making, but at the same time, I want to keep it in the backpack to be able to pull it out at an appropriate time. Is that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's knowing how to use your emotions and not letting your emotions use you.
Yeah.
So most of us, as you know, Ben, are dictated by our emotions. We become, I often refer to the analogy of a horse and a chariot. The horse is the emotion and it becomes a runaway emotion. And trying to tame such an instinctual emotion such as anger. I mean, try taming an emotion of anger when you're sitting in traffic or when someone's just cut you off. And you just want to, roll down the window and hurl
Take their
expletives
driving.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's because our emotional reptilian system in the brain is geared towards that survival mechanism. Now, we're not talking those sort of situations there. We're talking destructive anger that is causing, destructive relationships. So, for example, you come home and your partner says to you, "Oh, did you get the milk?" And you have some wonderful news to share with your partner, and suddenly you erupt into this anger. Now, if that's happening all the time, then there's a destructive pattern there that's causing distress within the relationship. So it's a matter of using mindfulness and self-inquiry and journaling in order to discover what's at the root of this anger. Now, it is my experience that sometimes it stems all the way back to childhood, where the individual wasn't appreciated at a young age. And so our primary caregivers, we had formed an attachment style with these primary caregivers, whether it be our parents or whoever helped us grow up, that were destructive and that we weren't seen or we weren't recognized. And so when we then fast forward all these years later, when we're in this relationship, we've never healed and transformed these childhood emotions, and now we bring them into our relationships. And so effectively all we're doing is pressing replay on something that took place probably 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So self-inquiry then is, okay, what's going on here? Why am I being triggered by this? And it's a trigger. That's all it is. Someone is pressing a pain button on you, and you are reacting to it each time. Now, if we keep doing that, remember, we're building the circuitry in our brain and neural structures that are saying it is okay to do this. But the other side of us wants to break this pattern, don't we? And then we might blame our partner. We say he or she or they made me do it. But in fact, they are only the trigger. They're the mirror saying, hey, Ben, this is in you. It's not me. It's in you. Change you, and then this won't hurt you anymore.
Yeah, I like that saying that the only thing all your bad relationships have in common is you, right?
Yeah. Spot on.
Do you find is it anger or is it fear? What is it that tends to hold most people back from? And I know you've written a lot about that authentic self and being your authentic self. What is it that you find is like stopping most people searching after that or aspiring to be that? Well, what's kind of keeping us small as such?
I think it's the fear. Fear is the overarching enemy. And I say that not so much as though we've got to tame fear or abolish fear, but under most things such as anger, sadness, depression, low self-worth is always fear of identifying with our true self. And authentic self is really a way of saying our true nature, who we are as spiritual beings. And I'm not talking or invoking God here or religion or anything of that nature, but just saying that there's a higher dimension to who we are. We're just not this bone and flesh and thinking thought person. We are beyond that. We are predominantly greater than all these things. And so authentic self is really realizing that when we get rid of the thoughts that obscure realizing our core self, then we come into true alignment with that nature. So fear is almost a facade that stops us from realizing that true nature.
Yeah. So as in, you mean fear as in like fear that our authentic self is not good enough or doesn't live up to the person we think we should be for those around us, or?
Yeah. Being who you truly are. For example, I've found over the years that as I've matured from my 20, I was driven by ego, this sense of dominated by what others thought of me. Most of my interactions were based on that sort of model of thinking. As I've sort of got into my 40s, I now realize I've turned down the volume on that and allowed the core nature, which is love, to find its way through me. So in terms of my writing, my speaking, my interaction with others, I often say, how would love respond in this situation? And we're not talking about romantic love. We're talking about the basis of what the construct of this universe is, and this essence of love, compassion, kindness. Because when we identify ourselves as that, then all our interactions with people, others, and life begins to take on a new dimension. And Ben, that's not to say that we're not going to experience problems or difficulties. It's just that we begin to see life through the lens of love instead of through the lens of fear. So we literally flip the switch. And as you know, love can heal the body. So if we're operating on a predominant brainwave or thought wave of fear, that manifests itself in the body in terms of illness and psychosomatic problems throughout our body. When we learn to turn down the volume on fear and turn up the volume on love, suddenly love begins to heal those emotions, and those emotions disappear from our body, and our physiology literally changes overnight.
Yeah, the trauma is an interesting one, and I know that there's not necessarily a trauma scale, and I think that that's maybe what is another reason in terms of some people feel like their particular trauma or their particular issues aren't necessarily worth bringing to life because relative to others they're seemingly less. But I guess being a parent, maybe even more so, like it's kind of it's a tricky question in terms of no matter kind of what environment or what type of problem you tried to avoid by being a particular type of parent, you're still probably opening up in some degree, in some way, some sort of like traumatic play out event for your kids, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think for myself, similarly to you, I think a lot of my 20s was probably like decently negatively fueled, and it hasn't been until my late 20s, early 30s where you kind of develop enough self-awareness or develop that like observer a little bit more to be able to step back maybe from the situations or the circumstances that you find yourself in, and kind of take a breath before acting. But do you think that there's like, does that come with age? Like I feel like most young men, it's almost like getting to a specific point where they're in their late 20s for the majority where that begins to happen. Or do you feel like that tends to be triggered by a specific event or something like that also?
Um, it may happen. For example, I've met people in their 50s and 60s who are still regressed as children.
Yeah.
I mean, it still plays out. If we haven't healed our unconscious child, we carry that inner child within us all the time, Ben, and effectively all our interactions are our unconscious child trying to express itself in some form or another. So it might be, in a form of love. It all comes back to love. It's always about receiving love. Ultimately, we are just grown-ups trapped, in this body that has this inner child within us. And to the degree we haven't resolved our childhood wounds, they then become manifested in our adult life. It's as complex and yet as simple as that. And when I say complex,
Yeah, it sounds super simple.
complex to psychiatrists who are dealing with those syndromes, but as simple as the understanding of heal your inner child, understand the inner child, and then most of your relationships and problems in life tend to be a lot more workable.
Yeah. Do you think that's just a matter of actually putting some side of time to actually listen? Like, is that essentially meditation and stuff, right?
Yeah, and there's some really great practices you can do. There's wonderful books on the topic where you do a lot of inner child healing and transformation, such as writing with your non-dominant hand, and you just do some free writing, and these are inner child sessions. And they're wonderful experiences. I mean, I've done them personally and also with clients. Therapists also use it, psychologists and psychotherapists, in terms of the healing process. And some amazing things tend to come forth. And And they're basically unconscious, just unconscious thoughts that have been repressed because society or family may have told this individual that it's not safe for you to express yourself in this manner. And so they hide behind this facade, which is then the veil of fear. And they go through life thinking that life is fearful, dangerous. Their interactions with people are dangerous. The world is not a hospitable place. But when we get to the heart of the belief that's created from a childlike state and look at it and go, wow, this is what I created as a child. And let me give you one primary example. I had a fear of water when I was growing up. I could not swim until probably the age of 7 or 8. And so when we'd go to school swimming lessons, I was the only child that could not swim. And I would have to go to a child's pool, and my mother would have to come down and accompany me. And I felt such shame that 29 students could swim and I couldn't. And I told myself, I created a belief, and that belief was I was not good enough. I remember working with a clinical psychologist in this capacity in the mentoring program, and they said to me, and it was one thought, one self-inquiry they asked me that blew apart my whole belief, and that was, Tony, what do you think a 7-year-old knows about life? And I went, oh my God, that's true. So from that experience, I told myself via a belief that I will never be good enough. And I perpetuated that belief for at least 21 years until I challenged that belief. And then it just blew up and it had no precedence over me anymore.
Do you think that one of the roadblocks to people wanting to do this kind of work is just genuinely how confronting it's going to be? Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. And they say that healing trauma is actually more painful than the initial wound.
Yeah.
Um, Yet most people only undertake it, Ben, when they've hit rock bottom, and they have to do the healing. And so my process isn't about going deep into it, but just doing it on a regular basis through self-inquiry, through meditation, through mindfulness. And it's almost like, we brush our teeth twice a day, but we don't practice the same level of hygiene with our mind and our thoughts until it becomes a problem.
Yes.
So what I advocate is doing it on a regular basis, but to a lesser degree, so that we know who we are and what is actually happening below the surface.
Yeah. Knowing who we are is a topic I've spoken to a number of guests with, and I think it's you feel like you know who you are until you ask the question and realize you tend to draw a lot of blanks, right? Like, we speak a lot to our clients about developing, a value system, right? Like, what are your top 3 or 4 values? And if you've got 10 or 12, like, none of them are super important to you. But when you actually try to sit down and write down 4 words that kind of define you or describe you, it's actually a much harder activity than what it would perceive to be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And knowing ourselves is a lifelong process. We get snapshots of who we think we are, but it's only until we're challenged and put to the test and pulled apart that we really discover who we actually discover our true selves in the darkness, not in the light.
Yeah.
If I put you, I love Navy SEALs. I've always loved them because of the way they train. And they have a system, the BUDS training, where they're put into this 6 to 12 week program in order to be pulled apart psychologically, emotionally, physically, to determine who out of 180 people are going to be Navy SEALs. And of those, the failure rate is almost 85. I think the attrition rate is 85%. So literally out of 180 candidates, probably 15 will actually graduate. And it's the same sort of relationship that we have with ourselves. We don't know who we are until we go through the difficult training of being in the darkness.
Yeah, I think the COVID situation, definitely here in Melbourne too, have been a good one, right? It's not that the lockdowns necessarily are building character so much as they're revealing it, right?
Yeah, and the way I see it from a holistic point of view is that COVID has really shone the light on our dark side. I mean, COVID is really on a mass scale of humanity has really said, right, you've got to sit with yourself now for weeks, if not months on end, and be in the dark and discover who you really are. And for many, regrettably, it's just the most difficult thing they've ever had to face. But it's really teaching us, and what I see it as on a spiritual level is a great awakening. And I'm not a fortune teller. I have no idea of what the future holds. But what I can definitely say is that in the next 5 years, I think that humanity and on its consciousness level is going to see a huge awakening on an amazing level. And we're beginning to see it now. I mean, people who have got married in Melbourne, for example, and have bought all the food for the wedding, are donating it to charity. People are going out of their way to help others. We're seeing compassion, kindness, empathy taking a front row instead of greed and that ego. Have you sort of seen that?
Um, I think two things mostly. I think one, unfortunately, a lot of like what sells and what the media perpetuates is the complete opposite. So it makes it much harder and much more distorted to actually see the amount of good that definitely is going on. And I think that it's easy to fall down into that kind of spiral when all the messaging that you're kind of given, all the message that you're exposed to is doom and gloom and lockdowns and case numbers, etc., etc. I thought from like my background is corporate finance, and I definitely thought coming out of COVID, especially here in Melbourne, that we would see like the rise of the freelancer, like much more of people being like, you know what, like the safe corporate job turns out isn't actually all that safe anymore, or I can do this kind of work on my own where I'm, can be more productive, and if I can be more productive and fulfill two roles, in the same amount of time, why wouldn't I do that? That I guess remains to be seen, but maybe is on its way. And I think the longer that we kind of go back into the office for 2 or 3 weeks and then get sent back home for 2 or 3 months, like maybe the more that is kind of coming down the pipe. But
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's the lockdowns are a funny one, and I guess the unique situation, especially here in Australia, and even more so here in Melbourne. Like we were sort of chatting before. The last like two, well, this one I guess in the midst of, but even the 3 week one, those ones really felt a lot harder and a lot longer than the 3 6 months of last year. And I don't know if that again is thinking we were through it, and maybe thinking like those dark, really confronting, challenging times was something that we'd made it through, only to be like pushed straight back in there a number of weeks later. But yeah, I think that you are right. Like those sort of events are happening more and more, and it is a shame that those kind of things aren't what's sort of making headlines, or getting clicks and likes and eyeballs.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well, unfortunately, it doesn't sell.
yeah,
That's the thing. I mean, the media is perpetuated by fear, and so it sells us this distorted image. I mean, get on the news. I mean, far out. If I snip on the news on Channel 9 or 10, they'll tell us without any knowledge, mind you, that oh, geez, we're going to go into a 2 week lockdown. Brace yourself. And they have no knowledge from the sources that are actually, the health authorities that are actually creating this. But they've got to change the way the news is disseminated in order to keep you watching, because it grips you, doesn't it?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think that's been, we've also seen the rise of the anti-vax.
Oh, yeah, haven't you?
So I guess YouTube algorithms kind of, and that's the other issue is, you try to engage with people, and I think we've lost. I think the one thing the podcast has really taught me is that conversation really is a skill and it's an art form, and I think the ability to have conversations with people over an extended period of time is regressing, and even more so is our ability to have a conversation over a long period of time with people that don't think exactly what we think. And in a world that is 10-second clips and 1 minute videos and stuff like that, it's quite hard to sit down and have a conversation about like, oh, rather than just this headline that you've given me, like I'd actually be interested to know all the things that have driven you to actually think that, so that we can kind of work backwards from that point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I hope in many ways, hopefully the podcast is a platform that allows that kind of thing to come up, and I think definitely it's, you know, an avenue for a lot of people now that the barriers to doing something like this are actually pretty small, right?
Yeah, I mean, conversation drives it drives it, Ben. You're quite right, and I just finished reading a book, and I can't remember what the title was, but it was fantastic. And there was one particular chapter that caught my attention, and it was about the vaccine, and it was about, you know, the conversations, but it was based in Canada and in a sort of a remote region. But most of the families that live in that region wouldn't vaccinate their children. And so this doctor would come in, and I think they called him the vaccine whisperer. And so what he would do is have these one-on-one conversations with these people and find out what their fears were
Yeah.
and give them the right information. And in almost every single case, the people would change, the mothers would change their mind and vaccinate their children. And we're talking, you know, their first immunizations here. They would vaccinate their children and then go off and tell 10 people or 10 other mothers to bring their children in and get vaccinated. And what was underlying this was this fear that had been passed down through decades and familial generations that vaccines aren't safe. But there was no evidence, but they created this habit and these thought patterns that began, you know, this sort of overriding sense that this must be true. I mean, for God's sake, Lance Armstrong convinced himself that he'd won the Tour de France 7 times. And Oprah Winfrey asked him, and he said, yes, if you believe a lie enough that it becomes truth.
Yeah. Yeah, we had Dr. Kieran Kennedy. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, who's based here in Melbourne. He came on the podcast and we chatted through the vaccines, and he said basically the same thing. Like, what people try to do in terms of anti-vax is bait it with a super emotional driver like autism, right? And that tends to be how it catches fire, because you're really just preying on like parental insecurities, you know? But the other thing to come out of that is we're almost too fortunate now, right? Like, no one really remembers what it's like to have polio ripped through like Melbourne, and it's like because we got a vaccine that we don't have to go through that. Yeah,
Absolutely.
so
You know, getting back to that original question that you asked me at the beginning of the podcast, fear. You
yeah,
can see how it's all driven by fear. But when we have these open conversations, Ben, and ask the person, what are you fearing? How can I help you with this? Then the person suddenly goes, oh, someone's actually listening to me. Oh, I don't have to carry this fear anymore.
yeah. Yeah. Why do you think it is that I mean, and again, it might be more of that lockdown with more people spending more time on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that, but that we've become so like deeply polarized. Like there's so much less space for middle ground and that conversation to occur. It's either you're completely with us or you're completely against us.
Yeah. I guess if we look at it from a spiritual point of view, it's the fact that the ego tells us, and this is what we spoke about earlier. We've got the egoic self, the ego, and then we've got our core self, the true self, which is the self, you know, the loving self. The ego tries to dominate the conversation and tell us that we are right, and that it builds this foundation and this structure around this belief that I am right. And if that gets challenged, there's this sense of moral outrage. How dare you challenge me? I remember a decade ago, I was doing corporate speaking at an event, and we were talking about drinking, or the benefits of drinking artesian water. And this woman from the back of the audience just went into this absolute vitriol rage of how would you know? And anyway, it got quite ugly. After the session, I approached her and asked her a little bit about her background. I wanted to genuinely understand her, and it turns out she was brought up on a farm, and drinking tap water was quite normal. So she felt as though I challenged her belief that only artesian water is the highest quality water, and that anything less than that is inferior. So it came down to the ego. Her ego was challenged. But instead of having an open discourse, and trying to find what was at the heart of that, she shut down. And a lot of us do that. We don't want to be right, and we will go to absolute extremes to uphold our false beliefs, because to challenge them means, well, if we challenge these beliefs, then what foundation is my thinking based on? I mean, if I suddenly cracked open one of your beliefs, Ben, and got you to see the light, then you might say, "Oh shit! If I don't believe this, and I've believed this 20 years, what else am I not
Yeah.
believing that's true?" And so suddenly everything comes crumbling down, and your self identity, bang, takes a hit. And people don't want that. They would rather be wrong than be shown that they've just merely created an inferior belief. And like your software program, most people aren't running Windows 3.1, you know, because the programs that are created these days, like Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop, are made on the structure of running a Windows 10 or Windows 11 coming up. But what we don't do is we don't update our beliefs. We keep running these scripts and hoping that they're right and throwing them out into the universe or on social media. And when someone challenges us, we defend them.
So what then, like evolutionarily, what's from what I can tell, like we spend a portion of our time basically building an ego, and then the rest of our lives trying to quiet it down and kind of like disempower it. So what would be like why what's the rationale, I guess, for like the ego in the first place?
So it's been said that we spend the first half of our lives accumulating thoughts, beliefs, and ideas of who we think we are and what the world is, and the second half of our lives letting go of those beliefs
Yeah.
to come back to our true nature. So the one simple remedy that I often tell people, and this will absolutely save your life, is just keep an open mind.
Yeah.
And there was a person that said, I think it was James Dewar who created the Scotch Dewars. He said, minds are like parachutes. They work best when open. And the understanding is just keep an open mind to the degree that what you've believed up until this point is true. Then if it gets challenged, if you discover new ideas, then be willing to upgrade that belief. And there's a really good example of this. Professor Noakes, the is it the physiology, the Australian physiologist, who believed for so long that a high carbohydrate diet with athletes was the only way to actually increase performance. Suddenly, he developed type 2 diabetes and went, I think it was a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet. He followed that for a number of years and literally almost transformed and healed his type 2 diabetes. Suddenly, he began to practice that with his athletes, and using ketogenic type and low carbohydrate diets with his athletes, and had a complete transformation. And he came out in the media and said, "Hey, I'm a scientist. I had it wrong. I really thought high carbohydrate diets were wrong." Now that took some absolute guts to get to that point, didn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think yeah, it's you almost want to take the mindset that if someone can show you or debunk or present you with new information or new evidence to support a different way of thinking, that you would be able to adopt that. And I think we all think we're better at doing that until the time comes to do it, especially if it is a fundamental or foundational belief. Yeah.
Yeah, but see, the ego then, Ben, just getting back to your question, it convinces us that it's right, it's right, it's right, it's right, it's right. So we tend to vacillate between the ego and the true self. So we go here, then we go here, then we go here. It's about finding middle ground because we need the ego. The
Yeah.
ego is healthy. It helps us survive, but it's a matter of finding the middle ground and keeping the mind open and saying, right, I'm not fixed and firm on my beliefs because they may change at the drop of a hat. And I'm always open to learning new things from even unsuspecting sources. I mean, I've learned some amazing things from people who I thought could never offer me anything. And they open my awareness to new things, new way of thinking, and new way of living as well. So it's just keeping an open mind and upgrading our beliefs.
Yeah. I'm interested to know your take on things like psychedelics in terms of like trying to quantify a mystical experience in terms of like overriding the ego or using that as a means to think a little bit differently. I know there's companies like Maps out there and guys like Rick Doblin and Michael Pollan. I'm not sure if you're a Joe Rogan fan, but they've been on the podcast quite recently and talking about in particular treatment of like PTSD with psilocybin. Do you put much stock in that? I guess the goal would be able to have the same experience without needing to supplement down that path.
I've never experimented with psychedelics. I know it has a lot of therapeutic benefits, but obviously within a controlled environment. There are shamans that use a lot of psychedelics in their healing process, and microdosing and so forth. Regrettably, I think a lot of people, when in the wrong hands, they use it to their disadvantage, insofar as it becomes something that they use every day, such as drinking alcohol.
Okay.
Whereas what it's meant to be used is in sort of some therapeutic form of function where you're microdosing it and using it intermittently in order to create either a state in which to access information or heal and transform on a physiological level.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. The stuff is interesting, but I think the brain in general is such a like the more you learn about the brain and its impact, and then the more you have conversations which are almost more philosophical, right? Like kind of what we're talking about as opposed to physiological, it just adds another layer of like complication on top.
Oh, it's so wonderful. My fascination for the last probably 8 years has been the subconscious mind, the unconscious and the superconscious, and really harnessing the power of that. And a lot of the work that I do on a personal level, call it hacking, is things like getting into superconscious states when I'm about to drift off to sleep, and the power of the imagination, using my imagination to create states as well. So because I haven't been able to swim, I've been trying to change my swim stroke, and I don't want to lose all that work that I've done. So I do these imaginary processes where I imagine myself swimming and I feel the water. I imagine what my stroke is like. I move through those processes on a daily basis. And it turns out that when we had the last lockdown, I didn't lose any of that technique when we went back into the water.
Yeah.
So I keep using that imagination and working on my body so I don't lose those skill sets. And I love that area.
Do you put like neuro-linguistic programming and affirmations and that sort of stuff? Do you think they're as effective as like the visualization?
With the verbal components such as NLP and affirmations, they are helpful or useful to the degree that the individual believes them. If the individual doesn't believe them, then they're literally like reciting words the whole time. It's been my personal experience and also researching this area over a decade or so, is that visualization is powerful because we can invoke emotions and the visual context in order to elicit a response within what they call the ether, the universal ether, the framework, the structure of reality. And we can almost bend reality to our liking if it's done correctly. And it takes a lot of practice, but it literally can be done through practice.
Yeah. Can you just expand on that a little bit more? Like I get that your perception of what's occurring around you and what's going on around you makes that your reality of what's going on around you, right? Like if you're quite negatively mindset driven, then events or obstacles or challenges or inconvenience are always going to seem like this is your lot in life, right? Like it's always something quite personal. Is that kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah, but even outcomes, that might be outcomes such as just simple outcomes. I would imagine that most of your listeners are dialed in because of nutrition. Is that right?
Yeah, probably. That's probably how they get their first exposure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, they might want to lose weight, but they've tried every sort of diet under the sun, and things haven't worked. But But what might be at the heart of their um, experience is their beliefs. There's a belief somewhere that's blocking them. So when we move into imagination, we bypass the belief process because we're not working on a conscious level. We're now working on a unconscious or a subconscious level. And so we're really impregnating the mind with images, words, and emotions to create that state. So the individual might start focusing on the feelings and the visualization of having been the desired weight. So, for example, if someone wants to get married and they want to, get into their suit or their wedding dress by a certain date, they imagine themselves and the feelings that are evoked being in that state. They might imagine themselves being congratulated on being, or looking so wonderful on that day. And the more they practice that, suddenly their subconscious behaviors start materializing in real life. So they might go to the supermarket and instead of going straight and buying the Tim Tams, there's this sort of pull. Well, no, I don't really need this. And they can't explain it, but that's the subconscious mind creating their life. It's creating their belief, their perception, because they've willed it to do so. Now, to take the flip side of that, Ben, most people are creating their life unconsciously and they're calling it fate.
Yeah.
So they're driven by all their beliefs and their unconscious programmings from childhood. And then they're getting into relationships and making terrible decisions. And then they say, oh, well, it was only meant to be. That's life. That's my lot.
Yeah.
And sure, because you've created that lot. And you may not consciously know that that's your lot in life, but you have power to reverse engineer that process and create a new future by priming the subconscious mind, by creating new beliefs, by having a new perception and an open mind as to what you want your future to be.
So how do you begin with a client in terms of even having that conversation to provide them with a sense of self-confidence enough to get started? And before like they start, because once people do get started on sort of whatever new task that they're kind of under, if they can commit to XYZ change for a short period of time and start to get a little bit of feedback that things are moving in the way they want, then that starts to build their confidence in, I guess, the direction they're going and the way that they're getting there. But when it comes to some of the big, life-changing stuff that you kind of talking about and you would speak to your clients about, how do you start to build self-confidence in something that may not manifest for, an extended period of time?
Sure. Well, it literally starts with laying the groundwork and doing the simple stuff, the stuff that we can control. So, many, many years ago, I worked with a barrister who would be in court for long periods of time. And when he'd come out of court, he'd eat these high sugary foods and high fat foods because his brain needed energy. And then he'd vacillate between states of depression and then states of euphoria. And it was, his dietary choices that were driving his emotional state and his physiology. He'd put on weight, he'd lose weight. And so it was really getting to the heart of why this was happening. So we generally start with small wins on the board. So, eliminating toxic foods. If that particular client wants to lose weight, for example, I mean, the situation might be the person wants to increase their productivity or, improve their career aspects, their career goals. So depending on what it is, it's starting small, getting small wins on the board, showing them that it is possible, journaling, self-inquiry, it might be meditation. It's just doing physical things first. Then once they've achieved these physical aspects and seen, wow, I'm actually empowered. I'm getting results in my life. I just got that job promotion. I lost 5 kilos. I'm feeling confident about myself. I got asked out on a date recently. Then it's taking that next step. The next step might be then the visualizations. It might be the affirmations. It might be going deeper into the self-inquiry, and going up to that next level. So I'm always guided by the client, and they are telling me by virtue of the results they get what we do next. And
Yeah.
there is always something to do. Always. There is always. I've never met a single person that there isn't something to take it to that next level.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the self inquiry is probably the most interesting piece that we've kind of spoken about. Like, I think it kind of like there's a you talk about a hierarchy, but I almost feel like it somewhat works in a circle, right? Like it takes an element of self awareness or really like subconscious like come through to actually want to take charge and actually want to make change, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
that's almost then again a stage that you're actually aspiring to get to as part of the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Ben, sometimes, and I hope I haven't sort of, confused your listeners to feel that self-inquiry is, lying on a couch with a therapist and talking about your childhood. Self-inquiry is as simple as this: asking yourself this one simple question every single day and letting it become your journal prompt. How am I feeling?
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. If you got up every day for the next 30 days and the first thing you did, instead of turning on your computer or check your Instagram or scroll through Facebook, to write in your journal and put the heading, how am I feeling today? And write down what comes to mind, you will have changed your thought structure and your neural patterns and your emotional constitution within that 30-day period. And I'm not talking about a complete transformation, but you will have set the groundwork for a transformation that then creates the next layer of the transformation to reveal itself. So, transformation is about layers. You don't go from A to B. You don't go from, overweight sitting on a couch to running a marathon in a week. It's a transformative process, as you know, but you set the tone for that transformation to occur by revealing the next layer, because your consciousness becomes readied and primed for that next layer. But if you're not ready, it'll push you back. It'll spit you out and say, hey, Ben, you're going too fast for me. And
Yeah.
that's what often happens in weight loss programs. People are going too fast and
Yeah.
they get spit out and they put the weight back on.
Yeah. Yeah. So and with your like I'm assuming you journal every day. Do you give yourself a time limit, or are you saying like I'm just going to answer the question and then move on from that point?
Yeah, I just start with that simple question: how am I feeling today? And sometimes I'll answer that in one word. But I really get a sense of trying to tap into my subconscious mind. And I also go to the degree that I listen to my inner child. And sometimes my inner child will tell me things that just aren't congruent. They don't make sense to me as an adult. But for me, having recognized this and done this for so many decades, it always comes down to play. And I don't play enough, and we as adults don't play enough.
Yeah.
So one of the things I love and my inner child loves is I have two nephews and a niece who are all under the age of 10. I devote at least 3 times a week to spending time with them in a play format, because that's what my inner child wants. It wants to play. And so play may not be just playing with children, but play in the terms of just going out in the rain, and getting wet or doing something that you've never done before.
Yeah.
But that's about listening to that inner child.
Yeah. Do you like Brene Brown? You'd be a bit of a
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
she's
yeah.
great.
She talks a lot about like the importance of play and kind of what differentiates play from just like forced kind of like interaction as well. Like there is quite a difference.
Yeah.
Like if you if you're playing Monopoly and your whole like thing is to make sure you beat your partner, like that's not play. Right?
No, and if you've ever looked at, have you ever seen the Dalai Lama when he's interviewed with people? Have
Yeah,
you
yeah,
seen how he does this thing? He'll grab the person's nose, the interviewer, and he does this funny thing. Hey, look, there's your nose. I mean, this is a man in his 80s who apparently still devotes time throughout the day to go to a lake and, swim in his robe. He's just immersed in play, and that's his childlike state. So he
Yeah.
doesn't take life seriously.
It's funny that we always have this pressure to like grow up. Like when you're in your teenage years, I think all you want to do is be 18. All you want to do is be an adult. And then it gets to a point sometimes when you're adult and you're like, why did I rush the whole process? That's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, yeah. We
Yeah.
try and rush the process of go from child to adult, and when we get there, we go, "Wow, this isn't all it's cracked up to be." And what I'm proposing is that we reconnect with that inner child and listen to it, because sometimes it wants us to do things that we may not want to do as adults. I mean, that's why impulse and intuition is so wonderful, and that's what children are led by. And I often tell my clients, do things like that. So I say to them, "Hey." I train a lot of corporate clients based in the US, and I'll say to them, "Hey, tomorrow I want you to go down to the beach, roll up your trousers, and walk barefoot into the water and just have a walk along nature." And they freak out at the thought of doing that during work hours. Or I might say, "Have a nap, and then when you wake up, I want you to do some coloring in, or something like that." But they eventually find that playtime energizes them and fuels their creativity, and
Yeah.
they're able to be more creative in their work environment.
Yeah. 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 And sleep too for that,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. I'll ask you a bit more of a selfish question, which is more for me than probably for the listeners. But as a parent, like how can you not necessarily invoke so much, but what are the steps that you can take to try to help encourage, I guess, your kids to be kids, or to develop a little bit of self awareness, and I guess probably more so for parents of teenage kids, young teenage kids, they start to move from that sort of play experience more into starting to feel like quite self-conscious and that sort of stuff too, as bodies change and develop. How can you handle, do you have any advice for parents in that regard?
I guess, Ben, it's been my experience working with my nephews and niece, that asking questions and being curious about them has been really important and foundational in their learning and development, because they're modeling their life based on your feedback and how you interact with them. So being curious. So um, parents have this sense that because they're parents, they need to tell their children what life is. But really, what they're doing is just passing on their beliefs to the children. And naturally so, because that's what they've learned. But what I'm suggesting also is add an element of curiosity in there. So you might ask your son or daughter or child, why do you believe this? Why did you draw that? What do you think of this? And just be more inquisitive about their thought process and listen to it, and don't necessarily add a commentary to it. Oh no, most parents say, "Oh no, Johnny, you can't do that because people will think that you're crazy. You can't play with dolls, Johnny, because men don't do that."
Yeah.
So it creates this confusion for the child. Instead, why don't we create this foundation of curiosity and look at the world as the child looks at the world, through a sense or a lens of curiosity? Why have I chosen this? What impulse allowed me to create this? Why am I creating this? And let them figure it out. Don't have you tell them why they did it, because you may not know. I mean, most people don't know themselves,
Yeah,
let
exactly.
alone know their children.
Yeah.
But let them work it out, because when they work it out, that is the foundation for self-worth, self-esteem, and self-belief. When they can actually work through their problems, then eventually they'll grow up into robust children who really understand the value of self-inquiry and self-belief. They are able to work through their problems instead of putting it into a force or a person outside of them.
That's essentially cognitive behavioral therapy, right?
Yeah, yeah, they gain agency in themselves instead of believing that the agency lies in an authority
Yeah.
outside of them. But we can prime that from a very young age, through the curiosity process, just being curious and teaching them curiosity. And the first step is obviously priming the curiosity process, and then helping them then learn how to figure out their problems instead of running to mum and dad every time. And naturally, we're talking about small, minute
A
things. We're not
process.
talking,
Yeah.
yeah, we're not talking about cutting their hand and not telling their mum and dad about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe good advice for both parents and coaches, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just be curious, see the world through the eyes of a child. Why have I created this? What does this mean? And meaning is subjective.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe even better questions to be asking yourself as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's very, very true. And if we can use that then in our life as well, why am I believing this? What is at the heart of this belief? And if we ask those questions, and that's about that open mind, um, just keep an open mind. Why am I, we're challenging ourselves. And by challenging ourselves, we begin to see the truth. Because if we ask our subconscious mind the right questions, it will reveal the right answers. But regrettably, we ask ourselves the wrong question. So, if we try to lose weight and we haven't achieved it, we'll say, "Why am I such an idiot?" Well, if you ask your subconscious mind why you're such an idiot, it's going to respond
Yeah.
because you did A, B, C, D wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. Why do I keep choosing the wrong person in relationships? Well, because you have a history of attracting, dysfunctional people.
Yeah. Tony Robbins does a big bit on that. He's like, instead of asking yourself why you're fat, ask yourself like what you could do that would help you be more athletic, or yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's rerouting the way we speak to ourselves through the lens of curiosity. And at the heart of all those teachings is just the open mind and curiosity. Why is this happening? So you become almost a technician or a clinician. You are like, and that's one thing that working with psychologists in mentoring programs helped me, is to become a clinician and ask and look for clues. And also in my work as a personal trainer years ago, with working with injured people, is, why is this person injured? What led this to happen? Why are they exhibiting these emotions? And I'd write it down, and I wouldn't try and figure it out because I didn't know. And
yeah,
then I'd go away and maybe spend months researching it, and then go, it could be this. Then I test it. Okay, I got this result. Isn't this interesting? So we've almost got to adopt this scientific thinking with ourselves and our lives in order to gain a response or to gain the data. Then once we've got the data, we've got to push it to its limit and challenge the data.
Do you think it's inherently true that we have the answers and we're afraid to ask the questions? Like I always sometimes think all I've got is questions and not a whole lot of answers.
Um, Again, my experience is when I ask questions, they come at the most inopportune times. But I try and frame the questions in a correct way. And I leave it once I've framed the question and put it out there. And sometimes I oscillate between extremes, but I trust that the answer will come at some point. It may be days, it may be months, but it will always, always come.
So it's
And
not essentially the answer is not going to be a direct echo as soon as you ask the question.
no, it's
Okay.
never that, but it's an inner knowing. It's an impulse. It's just, it just feels right, doesn't it? It's like when you come home and your wife's there and you just go, oh my God, this feels familiar. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
But if you're asking constantly and you're not getting answers and you're putting pressure on your innate wisdom, then you're trying to create an outcome that doesn't necessarily exist. But
Yeah.
it's having the patience that the answers will come when you are relaxed enough to allow them.
So is that the part of the asking yourself the question in the morning about how you're feeling, is part of that too an element of like self-actualization where you write down that I'm feeling motivated, I'm feeling ready to take on the world, that's then how you kind of play out the rest of your day from that point?
Yeah, absolutely. But you may not be feeling self-motivated. I mean, there are days, probably in the last 2 weeks, man, I have struggled to get to the pool to swim because it's been cold. And where I swim is an outdoor pool. And because of COVID, they now get you to undress in front of the pool instead of in the locker rooms or the change rooms, rather. And I haven't been motivated because there have been 3-degree days. And I'll get there and I'll go, why aren't I? And I love swimming, but I keep asking myself, why am I feeling this way? And there's always some behavior or some limitation. And, sometimes it's fear, because I fear doing the work is going to expose my weakness. So there's some fear. Well, why is that? Well, it goes back to my childhood, because I could never swim properly, and I feel that I'll be exposed again as an adult. And okay, it's okay to feel that way, Tony. It doesn't necessarily matter. And it's just having that inner conversation with ourselves, and waiting for the answers to come, whether they be present or in the future, and being open to what answers do come, whether they're favorable or unfavorable,
Yeah.
and listening to them.
Yeah. And I guess there's no right or wrong answer either,
Well,
right?
no, because a wrong answer can lead you to a right answer.
Yeah.
A wrong answer can close the door on a bad opportunity, and save you a lot of time and heartache. A wrong answer can say, hey, don't date that person, because you're only going to keep attracting the same person and repeat the same cycle. So it's saying your subconscious mind will say, hey, stop it. You're doing the same thing, and it's creating the same negative result.
And that's essentially like that what we would call like a gut feeling, right?
Yeah, gut feeling, intuition, what's coming up for you, listening to that gut intuition. And that takes practice, Ben. It takes practice to listen and to put it into practice. And eventually you come to realize that the gut is accurate, but we've got to marry that with thoughts as well. And I'm not suggesting that we listen to our gut 100%, but we learn the language of intuition. And I wrote an article about that on my website. I think it's called How to Listen to the Voice of the Heart. And that is how to listen, decipher the language of the heart versus the language of the ego, because they speak in a different language. So the language of the ego is sort of, to use a metaphor, might be German, and the language of the intuition might be Italian. But the two are different, but we've got to learn German in order to learn Italian and know the difference. So
Yeah.
we've got to practice listening, practicing, putting it into practice, and then seeing what outcomes we deliver. And then eventually we realize, hey, hang on, intuition always seems to be right. And it's not pushy. It doesn't shove itself in my face. It's silent. It's caring. It's compassionate. Whereas ego says, go, do it. You're a failure if you don't do it. So it's pressurizing me to make decisions all the time. Now, do you want to listen to someone in your real life that does that to you all the time? Or do you want to listen to a supportive person that says, hey, Ben, you can do this. I know you can. Keep going. You'll do this. You'll get through this.
Yeah.
So that's, yeah.
Tony, I have like 100 other questions for you, but I'm also super conscious of the time. And I don't want to keep you all day, but I'd love to do this again in a couple of months down the road, and maybe
Absolutely.
revisit and do a part two. For anyone that does want to get in contact to you, or check out the website or the blogs, are they the best place to look you up on the website?
Yeah, absolutely. If they get on to my website, Tony Fahkry, TonyFahkry.com. I'm also active on all the social media channels, on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So if they just simply Google my name, that'll just show up all the avenues where I'm active.
Perfect. I'll put a link below to your website in the description for the podcast as well.
Wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you for your questions too.
No worries. I have plenty of them.